So we've got a perfectly functioning little stool, but it's a little bit boring, isn't it? So what am I going to do? I'm going to flare the legs out a little bit at the bottom. I'm going to carry the stretcher right through the legs and put some wedges through the outside. And I'm going to carry the tenons from the tops of the legs right through the seat and put some wedges in the top of those. Introducing angles can cause all sorts of problems, so we need to be consistent. I want my legs to not splay out any further than the extremes of the seat. They're 2 inches wider than the tops of the legs, so if I put 2 inches overhanging near the bottom of the leg there, take a straight scrap, connect that up within those 2 inches. I know that's going to work, and I can take my angle off there with a bevel gauge. Lock it down, and that's the angle we'll use for everything until we finish this project. Because I'm going to be splaying the legs, this stretcher is now too short, so we can throw that away. First thing I'm going to do is mark out for the through mortise in the seat, and we've got the lines we originally put in for the mortise. If I now use the bevel gauge to transfer those at an angle across the face edge, and then square those down the other side, which is the top of the seat, I think you can see that we can lay out the mortises between those 2 parallel lines, and we can cut in from this side to meet the mortises in the back. I'm going to reset the marking gauge for the distance in from the edge of the seat. Then I can mark for the mortise on the other side. I'll do all 4 of those, then reset the marking gauge for the inside line of the mortise. Before you commit to chopping the mortises from the top, do a quick visual check to make sure you've located them in the right place. Then score the outlines with a marking knife. Take care chopping the mortises, remembering that it's hollow underneath here because we've got the mortise coming from the other side. So just go very gently so you don't break out too much material. You can use the bevel gauge as a guide to what angle you're trying to aim for. To wedge the tenons after they've come through, I need a piece of hardwood, and I've got a little piece of sapele here which will provide a nice contrast. And I need to prepare it to be a snug fit across the width of the mortises. At the moment you can see our tenons aren't long enough to come right the way through, so we're going to have to move the shoulder back a fair bit, probably a quarter of an inch or so. We want them to come further than the top of the seat, and then we can plane them off flush afterwards. So let's give ourselves a fair amount, scribe a line right the way round and chop back that shoulder to increase the length of the tenons. Lay the second side up close to the first. Line up the second side with the first and transfer the lines across. That'll ensure you take the same amount of material off both sets of legs. After some careful sawing and paring, you should have some flared legs at the correct angle. At the moment, all we've got is through tenons. We want wedge tenons, so we're going to have to do something to the mortises and the tenons themselves. Thinking of the tenons first, we want to drive a wedge in them so that it's going to force the sides of the tenon, the cheeks of the tenon, out against the end grain in the seat. So we need to cut a slot in this direction. For the mortises, if we're going to be driving a wedge into the top of the tenon, that tenon needs somewhere to spread out into. So I'm going to widen the top of the mortise by the thickness of the thick end of the wedge minus a saw curve. And for this stool, I'm going to put that widening on the outside of the seat. So tapering from just a little less than the thickness of the thick end of the wedge through to the original side of the mortise on the bottom half of the seat. So the first thing I'm going to do is knife a line a little bit closer to the mortise than the thick end of the wedge. and that's nice and flat. Just 3 more to go. To prepare the wedges, I first mark the angle that I want on the end of a hardwood batten with a bevel gauge, mark it across the end and across the other side, and then cut off that angle. Now I think you can see with the angle up against the planing stop on the bench hook, we create the wedge shape in there that we want. I can put my wedge stock on the top there, mark it with a pencil and cut just outside that line. I want to plane a little flat on the sharp end of the wedge. Like so. Now we take the wedge, put the good side, flat side, against the angle face of the batten, lower that onto the planing board, push the wedge up to the stop, bring a plane in, and we can now just shoot that face of the wedge and just a few strokes really cleans up the sawn side, and we've got a perfectly cut wedge ready to insert into the end of our tenon. Obviously the piece we cut it from, we can now slice that off and plane in the same way, and we'll have a second wedge. Before long you'll have the 4 wedges that you need. With the wedge tenons ready to go, next time we'll be fitting the stretcher. Oops. Does this ever happen to you when you're planing the end grain of material? The end breaks out. It's not pretty, but of course there's always a way around it. So I've just planed the breakout off, so we've got a nice fresh end on here. But of course, if I bring my plane along again, when I get to cutting right near the edge, there's going to be an awful lot of pressure on these last few grains, and it's likely to break out again. So what do we do to avoid that? 2 options. The easiest probably is to put a back bevel on there. So we just bevel the back of the work. You can see there, put a slight bevel on there. That means that the very last fibres won't get touched by the plane as it comes this way, and they'll be supporting the ones that do get touched a couple of millimetres in from the end. This is very soft wood, very easy to break out, so I'm going to put a slightly longer bevel on there and slightly shallower. You should be able to see that quite obviously now. And if I plane, now I don't want to keep going because eventually I will get breakout. Now that I've taken the surface down so that the bevel has become quite small and we're nearly down to the depth we want, I can plane a little bit from this end, resting the toe on the flat that I've previously planed. Then plane up to about this point in the normal direction. Come back round again. Almost down to depth. Down to depth at this end now. One final pass, stopping before I get to the end. and that's finished. An alternative way to protect the end is to get another piece of the same thickness material, use it as a backer. I set it in a little bit higher than the surface I'm planing, clamp it in. I also want to make sure that it's clamped in this direction if I can. That just helps avoid any slight gap appearing in between them. Now I plane off the excess at the top of this block. I can start to feel the plane just catching on the surface that I want to plane. So I'm getting down to the right height now, and I can plane right the way through. The extra piece of wood has prevented any breakout on this far end.